Welcome, everyone. My name is Grzymala-Busse. I am the director of the Europe Center, and it's my great pleasure today to introduce Jan Vogler, who is an associate professor at Aarhus University in Denmark and previously served as an assistant professor at the University of Constance. Jan is an expert on political economy and especially its historical aspects. His book project is entitled The Political Economy of Public Bureaucracy, The Emergence of Modern Administrative Organizations. And I, for one, am totally looking forward to it because it explains why formal and informal bureaucratic institutions arise and vary as much as they do. His other areas of expertise include rivalry and competition, the European Union, and historical political economy of democracy and autocracy. And so today we're delighted to welcome him as he presents a joint project on imperial legacy with Dan Gingrich of the University of Virginia, entitled When Are Junctures Critical? The Legacies and Non-Legacies of the Suppression of Local Self-Government.
Thank you so much, Anna, for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming here today and taking your time to listen to the talk. I hope it will be interesting for you. And Anna already mentioned that this is co-authored with my friend Daniel Gingrich at the University of Virginia. And since she already read the title to you, I will not repeat it. So let me just jump straight into the topic and what motivated this paper. So there is a huge literature that many of you will be familiar with simply because it is so prominent, both in economics, but also in political science. And this literature deals with the long-term effects or consequences of historical events. And the term that is most commonly used in the literature is legacies. And the two most prominent studies in that literature that kind of kick-started it in the late 1990s was this one here by Laporte et al. On the legal determinants of external finance, broadly distinguishing between common and civil law systems and their long-term consequences. A huge literature has arisen from that. But then, of course, also the AGR piece, our recent Nobel laureates, right, which also really lifted this literature to prominence. And as I mentioned, it's not only in economics, though these first contributions were, but more recently, political science has also seen hundreds, if not thousands, of studies in this field. And two recent overview pieces, this first one by Cironi and Pepinski on historical persistence. And then we also have this one here by Simser et al., titled Dead But Not Gone, Contemporary Legacies of Communism, Imperialism, and Authoritarianism. So this is a very prominent literature. Many of you will be familiar with some of the seminal pieces in it. And I want to make two important observations with respect to this literature, and these partly motivate our paper. The first one is that almost all contributions to this literature deal with legacies that are positively identified. And what I mean by that is there was some historical event and there was a suspicion that it led to a legacy, and then indeed the authors find that some legacy manifested itself, right? What we almost never see in this literature is we don't see null results. And we also, I mean, we know that in other literatures too, we have a bias against publishing null results. And I think in this literature, it is even stronger than in other parts of political science. Another observation is that in particular, Simser et al. Tried to integrate the different strands, the subfields here of this literature, looking at communism, imperialism, and authoritarianism at the same time. And so they call for theoretical integration across these different phenomena. And that is what we are also trying to partly address here with this piece. So this last one here was an inspiration to us in terms of trying to create an integrated theory of different types of historical interventions that may have some commonalities in the way they generate a long-term effect. And the leading question, sorry, is there a question? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, but these falsification tests are not common in this literature. So that's not something a lot of people there do. So, yeah. Let me just now move on to the question. I'm happy, let's talk about this more in the Q&A if that's okay with you. So let me start with our guiding research question. So we focus on a specific type of historical event, and that is the suppression of local self-government. And we ask when and under which circumstances does that lead to political legacies? And so the starting point is that these different types of suppression of local self-government all constitute a form of alien rule, where there's some form of external force that intervenes in a territory and constrains the ability of the local population to select its office holders. And what we focus on is if there's a constraint on the ability to choose the executive, most of the time the capacity of the local population is especially violated in this respect. And these are all forms of alien rule. as conceptualized by Hector. The two primary forms in which this occurs is direct forms of imperialism, where some external power comes in and installs its own executive. And the other form is when we have a form of centralized authoritarianism that goes into certain territories and constrains the ability of the local population there to select their office holders. Now, we suggest that all of these forms of intervention have the potential to undermine democratic values. And the reason is, this is basically the flip side of the argument that Putnam et al. Make, where if you have positive experiences with self-government over extensive periods of time, he suggests that there will be downstream positive consequences for voting behavior, for civic culture, for the provision of public goods. So in many, many different ways, you see positive effects emerge from self-government. So if you suppress self-government, we suggest that there will be a possible negative effect on democratic values and therefore also on voting behavior, especially with respect to anti-system and authoritarian parties. So the key argument that we make is that these episodes have a potential to generate a legacy, but this potential is determined by two primary factors. One of them is the duration of the episode of suppression, and the other one is the scope of repression. So these two factors determine whether or not any instance of the suppression of local self-government will result in a long-term legacy. In our empirical part, in the empirical part of the paper, we cover both types of suppression. The first part is the imperial partition of Poland and in long-term voting behavior in Poland. And the second one is appointed mayors in Brazil and voting behavior in these Brazilian municipalities that had appointed mayors. So that's the overall starting point of our paper. Now let me jump straight into our theory and our theoretical framework. And here we make an important assumption. So a background assumption of our paper is that there's a dynamic complementarity between institutions and political culture. What this refers to as complementarity here means that the institutional framework that exists within territory and the political behavior of the population and the political elites are compatible with one another, right? So the institutions constrain behavior to some extent, but then the behavior also does not work outside of the boundaries of these institutions. Now, it is dynamic to some extent because we can imagine that there will be some form of exogenous shock, such as when an imperial power or centralized authoritarian regime comes in and constrains the ability of the local population to select its own office holders. We will conceptualize this as an institutional change. And this external shock may create a feedback loop that ultimately solidifies a legacy. But that does not always happen. And the critical mechanism here that decides whether or not such a legacy emerges is the choices that different citizens in different situations make. And the choices that we focus on in terms of our theoretical framework is the values that they try to instill in their children as a response to this institutional shock, but also the skill set that they themselves choose to obtain, especially if they are active in some form in the political arena. And the two factors that shape these choices are the duration of the intervention, where we differentiate between a transient and an enduring intervention, but then also the extent of repression, limited and encompassing. And here, the second part is split up into two subcomponents. First, the violent suppression of anti-regime ideas and actions, and the second one is the remaining opportunities for participation. And most of the time, if you have a suppression of self-government, there will be a high degree of correlation between those two subdimensions. So how do the mechanisms play out? Citizens, once they are faced with this external intervention that changes the institutional landscape, have an incentive to adopt new political skills, often because the political skills that they previously had under a situation of self-government are no longer as valuable as under the new institutional setup. So imagine, for example, an authoritarian regime comes in, severely constrains your ability to choose your office holders, to deliberate in public. All skills associated with this open deliberation in the political arena will be much less useful to you now. And maybe you have to adopt new skills, such as, for example, displaying loyalty to the regime or the regime's ideology by becoming a thought leader of the authoritarian regime. Now, even more important is parents who make choices about how they raise their children. And as you know, most parents are very heavily invested in the social and economic success of their children. And so they have to make choices about which values they try to instill in their children over long time periods. And in a case when, for example, an authoritarian regime intervenes, maybe it is less helpful to these children in the long run if they internalize values related to open deliberation, to dissent, things that are not compatible with the institutional framework, because they open themselves up to the violent suppression of anti-regime ideas and actions, right? So parents will be more likely to instill authoritarian beliefs in their children under this scenario, and that includes, for example, deference to authority. What is important, and I will just briefly emphasize this because this is a point that often comes up, this is not a deterministic theory, right? So not all parents will be simultaneously affected and will be affected to the same extent. Some may hold stronger beliefs, some may hold slightly weaker beliefs. Overall, we believe that as long as there's an institutional change, that will generate the incentives for at least some proportion of the parents to change their behavior in this respect. And so in the long run, the longer an intervention lasts and the more repressive it is, the more likely it is to actually manifest itself in change in these two dimensions. So it is the extent and the duration of the interruption that critically shapes the calculus of the parents, and it is longer and more repressive interruptions that generate stronger incentives to change the skill set. Because now, if I make an investment into a new skill set, what will happen is that it will pay off more in the long run, right? If I assume there will be an institutional reversion to the status quo ante, then I will have less of an incentive to invest. So the longer a suppression lasts, the more I will become convinced that it will also last for a long time. And similarly, it also represents a stronger incentive to change values for the same reason. So it's a long-term investment into the future of my children, but also more repressive interruptions mean that if I do not change my behavior, then I can face negative consequences from the imperial power or the authoritarian regime. And now, what does this do to voting behavior? Once I've changed my skills, I actually have a material incentive for promoting authoritarianism. And if I hold illiberal values, then I'm more susceptible to appeals by anti-democratic parties. And both of these will result in different voting behavior, right? So it's both a material incentive, but also the susceptibility to these appeals that are generated by these parties. So to summarize our theoretical framework, we broadly differentiate in a simplified notion between transient intervention and enduring intervention, and then between limited repression and encompassing repression. And our predictions are strongest for the two cases on the main diagonal, the one on the top left here, where we suggest that these episodes of suppression have a minimal potential for long-term legacies because they are short and not very repressive. And then the highest potential is for the enduring interventions with encompassing repression, simply because they generate the strongest incentives to change both values and skill sets. So that's our theoretical framework in a nutshell. Now, empirically, we look at two different cases, and the first case is Poland. And here we look at the split between different imperial powers, and we focus on two in particular, Prussia and Russia. And the reason is that Austrian rule is just a little bit more ambiguous. I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. And these powers split Poland at the Congress of Vienna. And it is a very important historical background for us that the imperial borders can be seen as quasi-random. And I'm happy to elaborate a little bit more on this in the Q&A, but the short version of this is that the main goal of the great powers was to create a stable balance of power on the European continent, and they were not so concerned with the conditions on the ground. And in fact, many balance checks between different values, pre-treatment values, across the historical border show that they are indistinguishable, the left and the right of the historical border. So there's very strong evidence in favor of the notion of quasi-randomness. Now, in terms of time, these episodes of suppression are generally enduring. They lasted until the early 20th century, until the First World War. And so there's not a change in the time dimension, but there's a lot of variation in the character of suppression, and especially between those two, Prussia and Russia, which for very long time periods had similar characteristics over time. So Prussia, in general, is seen as having a very high level of reliability of its institutions. It had a so-called Rechtsstaat, rule of law, and there was also a lot of constraint on the part of authorities in terms of repressing the local population. So this was an institutional framework that was with limited violent suppression of anti-regime ideas and actions. And there were actually multiple channels of participation for the population. So for example, as of 1848, there was an ability to participate in the Prussian Landtag. And then as of 1871, the Polish population had the ability to electorally participate in the German federal parliament. And so overall, this is a case that is clearly one of limited repression. Russia was the exact opposite, the polar opposite, which had among the three powers the most militarized, repressive, and extractive rule, often with complete arbitrariness in the behavior of its agents and representatives in the territory. And also, it did not allow for meaningful channels of political participation. So especially in comparison with Prussia, which allowed this broad-based participation, Russia was highly repressive, also as manifested in multiple uprisings against Russia that were all beaten down by the Russian army. Now, here's a quick map that shows you this historical division. The purple border is the one that we focus on in our paper between Germany or Prussia and Russia as of 1871 Germany. And what you see in pink are the municipalities that we consider here in terms of outcomes. What I want to emphasize is we actually exclude, and I will get back to this point in a moment, we exclude the areas of Poland that had very high population resettlements after World War II. So those that experienced the greatest population transfers at the end of World War II are excluded in our analysis. I have a map in the appendix on that. So what is our design? So our empirical focus is on the Law and Justice Party in the 2010s. And this clearly was a populist authoritarian party. This is also represented by the fact that once they made it into the national government, they actually attempted to dismantle the Polish constitutional system, interfered with the constitutional court. And so very clearly a party that was an anti-system and a partly at least authoritarian party. And here we focus on the electoral success of this party in the 2010s, and specifically on the local level, where we look at the party affiliation of the mayor, and we have various measures for different elections for the 2010s, the 2014 elections, and we also have endorsement by the party committee, even if there was no direct affiliation with the party. We use geographic regression discontinuity designs and then also other designs to test this. And we exclude districts that had the high post-World War II migration movements. And if you like, in the Q&A, I can speak a little bit more about why we chose the 2010 specifically, and also why we chose the post-Cold War period, because an alternative would be to look at interwar Poland, but we decided not to do that for various important reasons. So here's a first visualization of the results. What you see here in this graph is the red areas are the ones that have a PIS mayor. And what you can very clearly see is that the frequency is dramatically higher in the partition that was previously the Russian partition, right? And then here in the formerly Prussian partition, you actually see only very few instances of PIS mayors. Now, this is also visible in this graph. That gives you just the regular regression discontinuity graph. The red line here is the historical border. To the left, we have Prussia. To the right, we have Russia. And what you can see here is very clearly there's a jump at the border. Now, this is the whole sample, but we also constrain it to the optimal bandwidth, where we also observe an effect, slightly smaller, but still statistically significant. And then we also introduce a quadratic term and find the same results. So across multiple different specifications, we find that there very clearly is a jump in the probability of observing a PIS mayor as we move from the left to the right side across the border. So overall, these results suggest that the part of Poland that experienced just magnitudes larger or orders of magnitudes more repressive rule also has a much greater likelihood of electing a populist authoritarian party in line with the theoretical framework. And now let me move on to the second case. Oh, sorry, I have a little bit more on mechanisms. This is a new addition to the presentation, because what we also show is, of course, our mechanisms depend on a change in value system. And here it would be important to show that across the partitions, you also observe that there are different values. In the paper, we have a little bit more on the specifics of the values that we suggest, but one of the key values that is associated with self-government is a notion of self-efficacy. And we see this, among others, in that in the formerly Prussian partition, people display a much greater belief in self-fulfillment being the primary purpose of work, whereas in the Russian partition is a it is financial security that drives them. We also see that there are lower levels of transparency and professionalism in public administration in the formerly Russian partition, and this is related to the adherence to rules versus arbitrary practices. When the Prussian partition, higher levels of transparency and adherence to rules, less arbitrary practices are closely related to the higher transparency that self-government brings with it. And then finally, we also show in our own specifications in the appendix that there are significantly fewer mayors with higher education in the formerly Russian partition, and this we can relate substantively to the literature, not only on self-efficacy, but also on the literature on distrust in experts that is associated with the rise of populism, right? So you will see that populist actors, populist parties often display an extremely high distrust in experts, and so people with higher education also are experts in some form, and so there's greater distrust in them, explaining partly the lower success of people who run with higher education. Now, the second case is on another continent, but this is also because we believe that our theoretical framework on the suppression of local self-government is broadly applicable. So we would make similar predictions wherever there's a suppression of self-government. We would make the prediction that this plays out in similar ways, but we still, of course, have the contingency aspect of our theory that only under certain circumstances, under certain types of suppression of self-government, we will see the manifestation of an effect. And so in the second case, we look at Brazil, which experienced a right-wing anti-communist military revolution. This whole episode of authoritarian rule lasted for approximately 20 years. So it is below the critical threshold that we set of 1 generation. And initially, there was a political directive that created a new two-party system, and the authoritarian government actually institutionalized a tolerated opposition party. So they allowed for a constrained form of political competition. Now, what we are actually primarily interested in, and this is in part because of our ambition to deliver credible estimates that are causally identified, we look at the local level. And here the Brazilian authoritarian regime assigned appointed mayors to some of the cities, in fact, to 180 out of roughly 4,000 cities. And what is very fortunate for us is that we know the factors of intervention very well. So the Brazilian authoritarian regime actually said these are the factors that decide whether or not you get an appointed mayor. And we also show econometrically that these are the factors that very clearly predict whether or not you get one. So they did not lie about the factors that that were important to selection into this form of treatment. It is important to emphasize, though, that this was, from our perspective, a more limited form of suppression. And the reason is that even in those areas that had appointed mayors, so where the executive was constrained, we still see that legislative elections continue. And so what we see overall for this case is that even in those cities where the executive is constrained, the ability of the population to select it, we see limited state violence, and we see the maintenance of participation channels, specifically electoral contestation in the legislative dimension. And so overall, given the time period of less than 1 generation, given limited state violence, and given the maintenance of participation channels, this very clearly is only a transient suppression with a limited scope of repression, so much less likely to generate a legacy. In our empirical test, we make use of this fact that I just mentioned, that we know the factors of intervention, and we compare the electoral support for authoritarian successor parties. There were 2 of them in the Brazilian context, the PDS and the PFL. And we also look here at the first 2 democratic electoral cycles right after the intervention. And it is important to emphasize here that this generates hard test conditions for us. And the reason is that if there was just a minimal degree of stickiness, even if there was a very high decay rate of the legacy, we would expect that it would manifest itself in these very first elections that follow the authoritarian period, right? So here we create hard test conditions for ourselves because we would expect to find an effect if there is any at all. So then we compare the municipalities that had an elected versus appointed mayor. And I just mentioned this, the selection on observables design looks at these 4 factors that are the key drivers of intervention. We use distance from the land border because the Brazilian authoritarian regime was very concerned about security and had appointed mayors primarily in border areas. And we also look at mineral water deposits, which actually was a factor of intervention. And population and human development we use to proxy for state capitals. And of course, state capitals are of their own kind. And so what we also do is we exclude those because all state capitals had appointed mayors. Just as a robustness check, we also conduct the same test with completely excluding them. But in the main test, we assume that population and human development are the key factors that set state capitals apart from regular municipalities. And then we use two different kinds of models. One is a linear probability model with state fixed effects. And the second one is coarsened exact matching, given that some of these factors are continuous variables. Okay, so what are our results? So across the board, this is for the linear probability model, whether we use the full sample that includes capitals or whether we remove the capitals from the sample, but also whether we use controls or not, we actually observed that in none of the specifications, there's any significance to the estimate. This is, by the way, contrary to some papers in this literature, which show that even episodes of authoritarian rule, where you have some form of suppression of local self-government, do materialize in a long-term effect. But not in this case because of the circumstances of the case, right? So compared to other authoritarian regimes, this was a much less repressive one and also of shorter duration than some others that other scholars have looked at. As I mentioned, we also use coarsened exact matching as an alternative inference strategy here. And we show here as well that neither for the 1988 nor for the 1992 election, we observe any statistically significant effect. So very clearly, what we see here is we have a suppression of local self-government, but it is limited. It is only the executive that is constrained. So there's the possibility for people to maintain their skill set, their political skill set, using other dimensions. There's much less of an incentive for the population to change the way they raise their children. And we also discuss some of the mechanisms in the paper. I actually have no slide on this for the Brazil case, but I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A a little bit more. Now, I want to briefly talk about future directions of the paper and the reasons that we were fortunate enough to get an R&R on the paper. So we're currently revising the paper, and the reviewers actually gave us very, very insightful, helpful comments that we try to address. And I just wanted to briefly introduce some of the changes that we plan to you. And I would also be happy to hear your thoughts on them, right? So we have not implemented them yet, but we will do that over the next 3 months. And so the first, and I think very justified criticism, is that our paper is limited to the comparison of only 2 cases, right? And our theory is actually broader than that. It applies to both authoritarian regimes and imperial powers intervening in some territories. So there's insufficient variation across the dimensions of length and depth of the intervention. But there's also the question of, would we really observe this if we looked at other types of cases, if we distinguish between authoritarianism and imperialism? And what we plan to do as a response to this is that we plan to very systematically go through much of the literature of the last few years and classify different studies and create a systematic comparison of cases based on those published legacy studies and look at if the patterns that we suggest to exist based on length and depth of the intervention can be observed more broadly with the literature. There's a downside to this, and that is that what I mentioned earlier, that now results are hardly ever published in the literature. And so obviously there's a little bit of a gap here, but what we can show is tendencies, right? That if you have longer or more repressive episodes, that they might generate longer lasting or legacies of greater magnitude. So that's our first suggestion here. So what we can achieve is a more effective comparison between these different types. There's also the notion, and I think also very justified, that there's a possible divergence in initial conditions. And here I want to make an important clarification of our theory, and I kind of hinted at it during the talk. Our theory is actually a probabilistic theory. So it would be wrong to say that after 2 generations or so, the entire population now believes in authoritarianism. We suggest that under these conditions, there's a much greater likelihood for a legacy to emerge. But it is, again, a probabilistic theory in the sense that not all parts of the population will have adopted these authoritarian beliefs, right? It will be large parts of the population, but not all of them. And we believe that in all societies, whether it's an authoritarian or a democratic society, you will have some subset of the population that holds values contrary or incompatible with the current institutional framework, right? So even in democratic regimes, you have some people who have authoritarian beliefs. And even in some authoritarian regimes, you have people who have some democratic beliefs. And so given the probabilistic character of our theory, the divergence in the initial conditions becomes a little less important. And the reason is that we would expect the effect to take place regardless of the initial conditions, as long as there's some subset of the population that holds either kind of belief. Okay, that's important. And so regardless of the initial levels, what we believe is that the direction of the effect, when you suppress self-government, it will have negative effects in the long run. It is the manifestation, though, that is contingent, right? Now, there's also one more important criticism here is that, of course, in the Polish case in particular, what we can think of is that this is a bundled treatment. It is not just a simple treatment of suppression of self-government, but it also came with, for example, economic growth. In the case of the Prussian partition, it also came with better infrastructure. So there are other aspects that might be relevant. And we don't have a full response to this yet, but what we want to emphasize is just the domain-specific character of the theory. We focus on voting behavior as the primary outcome, and what we see as the key historical determinant is the institutional framework that generations of people lived under prior to that govern political behavior, both for the elites and for the regular population. And so just among all the factors that could influence voting behavior in the long run, we believe that this aspect of historical causes is the most important one. So, but hopefully what we can do potentially is that we can maybe also look more broadly at the literature where maybe bundles appear in different form, right? So maybe we have suppression of local self-government with economic growth, maybe without it, maybe with infrastructure investment without it. If we can see that the same patterns can be observed for many different bundles, then it would also hint at the likelihood that it is primarily the suppression of self-government as the most important factor that generates the legacy. And now very briefly on the differentiation between permissive and productive conditions, which one of the reviewers also wanted us to look at. And what we believe is that the institutional change creates permissive conditions in the sense of it actually creates a new incentive structure that might incentivize the population to act differently. But it is actually the strategic responses by the citizens that may be classified as the productive conditions, right? So the institutional change itself does not necessarily lead to change. It is really the strategic responses, right? So the permissive conditions alone, the institutional change that does not necessarily generate a legacy, is only in combination with the productive condition in the form of strategic responses by citizens who change their political behavior. The final point, and I think this is a really important one, is that people have also suggested, well, sometimes you do not have only people acquiesce to the authoritarian regime, you also have resistance and resentment against it, right? And this, I think, can also be explained by the probabilistic notion that we have, that there will be some people who will hold very, very strong liberal values that are incompatible with the authoritarian regime. And so resistance or resentment is indicative of those who have the strongest values in opposition. And as I said, we assume that some of these people will exist in all societies, but what it does not automatically invalidate is that the rest of the population will have an incentive to change their behavior in a specific direction. And so resentment in particular will occur if no actions by citizens can appease the intervening authority. So that might create a scope condition that we have to integrate into the framework. And so my final slide on the potential revisions is that we might have to integrate two scope conditions into the theoretical framework. The first one is that in order to create a real incentive change for the population to change its behavior, they need to be able to evade repression through an alteration of their behavior. If that is not possible, if you have an intervening authority that represses regardless of your change to behavior, then the incentives are not there to change your behavior. And then the second scope condition might be that you need consistently sufficient coercive power on the part of the intervener to maintain rule and order in the relevant territory. So if you don't have this coercive capacity, then our theory would not apply, simply because people could, for example, evade repression by moving to territories that are not under coercive control of the intervening authority. So these are two potential scope conditions, and I would appreciate any feedback on our plan changes if you would like to give feedback on that. But now let me conclude. So the broader question that our paper tries to connect to, and we cannot answer it in its full complexity, right? When do historical events have long-term consequences? Now, there's only one paper. It's a very ambitious paper, but it's only one paper. So we focus on one specific domain. We focus on the domain of suppression of local self-government and then long-term outcome voting behavior. And so we look at this concrete phenomenon and we suggest that such episodes of suppression have the potential to produce political legacies, but not always. It is a particular kind of suppression that has the highest potential, and that is enduring and repressive experiences. Those are likely to generate shifts, changes to long-term voting behavior in the territories that were affected by it. So it is not always that these historical episodes will lead to legacies. The character is crucial. It's the length and the depth where we differentiate between these two situations in Poland and Brazil, very, very different cases. And so we also obtain very, very different outcomes. And the future research is, we hope that with this paper, we encourage others to think more deeply about the problem of not having any studies that look at events that could plausibly have constituted a legacy, but that did not actually lead to a legacy. So we really don't understand very well for a lot of historical types of events, for example, natural disasters, wars. We don't really understand under which circumstances they will have a legacy at all, or under which circumstances they will not. And so hopefully this will inspire others to consider these other types of events, and then maybe apply or create a similar framework that also looks at maybe the length and the depth of the relevant historical phenomenon and how that can generate legacies in a specific dimension. But now I'm looking forward to your comments and questions on this project. And I want to again thank Anna for giving me the opportunity to speak here to you today. And I hope this was interesting. So thank you for your attention.
Open it up to some Q&A. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jan, for the great presentation. Beautifully presented, very interesting work that you put together. I just have a few points which I think align quite well with what the reviewers were getting to. So one is on this sort of counter hypothesis that actually authoritarianism will lead to sort of anti-authority values. And I wonder if one sort of synthesis out of that could be you've done by focusing on the local. So the situation where it leads to a sort of throwing off the yoke mentality might be one in which there is a lot of local autonomy, but no national rights. So to give an example would be like the United States pre-revolution, where the states or the colonies had almost, very high degrees of local governance, but they just didn't have those national rights like defense, constitution, and so on. So maybe that's some sort of way to get out of these two competing hypotheses. And then that kind of links to a sort of broader issue I had from the beginning of the presentation, which is that your research question setup is pretty vague. I mean, you even ended, I think you kind of admitted it a bit in the conclusion at the end on the first point, which is historical legacies, historical events have legacies. Okay. So I just wonder if tightening it up a bit around this sort of strictly on the authoritarian issue might help. And then I think what a lot of these type of papers have received criticism for in recent years is the assumption of quasi-randomness. So you mentioned like the imperial borders between Russia and Russia are quasi-random, which I guess historians would probably say there's a whole lot of not randomness going on in the selection of that border. And even when I've seen just sort of on social media and things, when people have used these historical borders to explain current voting patterns, which is done as sort of a meme almost, also in Iberia and other places, then you sometimes get people commenting saying, well, actually, it's not random at all. There's lots of reasons why this border was chosen. For example, ethnic Germans in high percentage there, and all sorts of other things. So anyway, and then the fourth small thing, and I'm sorry, I've spoken far too much, but you get out of the Brazil case, the null finding there by saying it was just too short for a full generation. That seems a little convenient. I mean, so what if it's 25 years and you see an effect? That seems to be pushing it. But a great presentation and great paper. Well done on the RNR.
Thank you so much. So I will just respond let me just give you some preliminary responses, right? So often, I have to take some more time to think about certain points you have made, but on the quasi-randomness, this is a really important one because the design really hinges on that, right? So let me just be very clear. There are some systematic factors that go into where the border was, but all of this played out at the aggregate level. So what European powers at the Congress of Vienna were concerned about was the overall size and military power of these great powers. And even back then, the Polish territories were relatively homogeneous in terms of population, in terms of, for example, everyone was Catholic. So there was not, in these areas along the border, there was not a big German minority also that would have decided whether or not parts would have gone into the left or the right into one empire or the other. In fact, the border did not coincide with any previous administrative boundaries, and it even split some private real estates. And the reason is that they really were not concerned with the conditions on the ground when they made that decision. So in that sense, I think you're right that this border was not quasi-random in a certain way. It was about the overall balance of power on the European continent, but it was quasi-random with respect to the conditions on the ground. And that is ultimately what matters to our geographic version discontinuity design. And as I said, many studies have shown this. Actually, in my dissertation, where I also use this border for another test, I quote a lot of historians. So I think even historians would agree with the conditions on the ground not playing a role. On the European continent, yes, but not on the ground. I also want to say that other cases, so you spoke about differences in repression, resentment, and also resistance, right? There might be cases that we are not fully aware of yet, where there's greater difference in the degree of repression over space, right? So in the Polish case, what we see is that repression is relatively homogeneous all across the Russian partition and then all across the Prussian partition. What might help with getting at the effects of resistance is if we had cases where we see a lot of variation in repression, spatial variation, and then maybe we also have measures for resistance. So it's just that these cases are not the best for that specific, for testing variation along this dimension. But also I feel like we are already looking at variation along so many dimensions that it might not be feasible to integrate another dimension into this project. For follow-up project, I agree. I could give you a little bit more advice, but maybe we can also get to others, and maybe we can, if you are interested, we can speak after the seminar. Yeah.
So
yeah, I thought it was very interesting. I think the thing that I found most kind of novel, I guess, is that is your emphasis on almost like democratic skills. With so I think a lot of the literature focuses on values and things like that, but the skill aspect is really interesting. And I was wondering if you could like talk a bit more about that.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. I mean, is there in the Brazil case, for example, is it the case that it's the same people who are running for office, or their kids are running for office? I mean, how is the skill being transmitted? I know that there's, they actually developed like various institutes to train people in democracy as well. And is there a connection there? But they also kind of relates to this other question about Poland. And there are, of course, many experts in the room about Poland. But I mean, one thing I wanted to ask you about in that case was, Poland, as I understand it, before it's been partitioned many times, and there wasn't, to what extent was there local government before this last partition, and are we really thinking about the erosion of that local government skill muscle, or was it the case that, I believe it's the case that the nobility was really free, but the regular Joes and Josephines didn't have much local autonomy. So to what extent are we thinking about this as a decline, or are we thinking about this as a regrowth after 1918, right? And basically between 1918 and 1939, right? So these are, and could you use the past partitions if there is variation in local government to sort of get at more of this? Is there a kind of a building up of skill capital over time that gets eroded in autocracy and then comes back up? I think that would be very compelling evidence.
Yeah.
If you could get this sort of change during the treatment period.
Yeah. Thank you so much for these questions. So let me start with the political skills. I think the Brazilian case is actually the one to illustrate it a little bit better, because what was the case in Brazil prior to the intervention was that local mayors were actually often vote brokers, and they played a really important role in mobilizing voters for certain parties. And then suddenly they were appointed by an external force, by the authoritarian government. So skills here refers not only to the broad number of citizens, but it actually also refers to political elites who may have acquired certain political skills that work under certain institutional frameworks, but then stop working under others. But what is crucial here is that actually these vote brokers, even though they were removed from their offices, they could actually continue their work in the other dimension, right? So I mentioned that legislative elections continued, right? And so there was still a role that these vote brokers could play. So a specific kind of political skill related to mobilizing voters for specific parties was still was still possible to be applied, right? And so in that sense, that is in line with the thinking that if other areas of political contestation remain open, some of the skills that you have acquired to use can still endure, and you don't have a super strong incentive to acquire a completely new skill set. Now, with respect to the different partitions of Poland and potentially using them, so one argument speaks against this, and that is that the other partitions did not last for as long a time as this one, right? And our critical threshold is one generation, and many of the partitions, so Poland was divided multiple times between the late 1760s and then 1815, the Congress of Vienna. And each of these divisions lasted for only a relative brief period of time, whereas this one lasted for 100 years. There was one episode that was relatively short, but that featured extremely high levels of repression, and that was Nazi rule over Poland. And here, maybe a really interesting result is that Wolja Czarnysz, in a working paper, looked at this. I was her discussant at a virtual conference, and she did not find an effect on voting behavior, even though it was highly repressive, external rule. But I mentioned to her, actually, our framework would speak to that because it was extremely short, right? So if it didn't last for a very long time, it was just not sufficiently many members of the population who had an incentive to raise their children in a completely different way as a response to that, right? And so underlying values did not change to the same extent. So I think you're right. Something interesting could be done, but some results suggest that these short interventions are not so likely, in line with our theoretical framework, to leave a legacy. So yeah. And let me just address one last point, and that is the initial conditions, right? And I think you pointed to something important. The Polish case is different. You're right. The nobility was the dominant actor here, right? So we did not have, unconstrained self-government. I think the reason why this is a little less relevant in the Polish case is really because of the length of the intervention, which was 100 years. So our argument would be that no matter what the initial conditions were, it was really more the character of the different kinds of suppression that lasted for multiple generations that shaped the outcome to a larger extent than any initial conditions would have, if that makes sense. Yeah. So, but we will meet for dinner, I think, so we can hopefully talk even more later.
Yeah, I have a question about the relationship between the values and so on, and the attitudes,
Yep.
and the longevity of these regimes. I guess your point is that that long-lasting regimes have a lasting impact on these values.
Mm-hmm.
I guess you could also make the opposite argument that in areas where there are certain values, oppressive or authoritarian regimes going to be expected to last longer. So I was wondering whether you could say something about that. And thinking, I don't know that much about Poland. I'm thinking a bit about Flanders and the Netherlands. I guess the stereotype that people have is that the Dutch are loud and confrontational, and the Flemish are quiet and non-confrontational, I would say. So I think the story that's usually told is the opposite of your story, in the sense that I think if you ask a lot of people in the Netherlands, in Flanders, then they would say, well, there was a political sorting, a partitioning in the 16th century, and the Protestants, the people with wealth, the intellectuals, they moved to the north. Mm-hmm. And so they got rid of the Spaniards, and in the south, where they had different attitudes, they didn't get rid of them for a few centuries. So what would you say in response to that?
Yeah, so the first point you make is a really interesting one, right? So you basically suggest that the degree to which I have the ability to coerce the population could influence whether or not my rule will last for a long time, right? That is basically the argument you're making. So I think this is where our modification to the theoretical framework in terms of the scope conditions would play a role, right? Because we do suggest that there's no question about the coercive power of the intervener to maintain rule for the relevant time period, right? Once that is called into question, I think it becomes a little bit more problematic. And I guess in the end, it is the length of the intervention itself that would be influenced by it, right? But maybe people have a relatively strong sense, at least initially, that there is a potential reversion to the status quo ante, right? And then they will be most likely to show forms of resistance against the authoritarian regime, right? So if that is successful, then short episodes will end early and will not generate an effect, right? But I think that would still be compatible with our framework, which suggests that if people have this perception that an episode of intervention does not last for a long time and the coercive power behind it is lost at some point, then it's unlikely to lead to a legacy. So I guess there's a little bit of endogeneity present here. I would have to think about how we would address that empirically. Yeah, I think the theoretical modification of the scope condition would make a difference to that part. I'm not very familiar with the case of Belgium, unfortunately. I will have to look in more detail into that, but you mentioned the aspect of migration. And I think migration is actually a mechanism that I did not mention that also works in favor of this theory, works in the same direction, because the people who are most likely to leave if you suppress self-government are those who most strongly believe in it, right? And so our mechanisms primarily focus on the change in the behavior of the population, but this change to the composition of the population would also work in the same direction. It is maybe a third mechanism that we could integrate. It's difficult to measure. Migration numbers are difficult to obtain, but it would work in the same direction. If you suppress self-government, those, or at least some of those who strongly believe in it, who really enjoy self-government, who do not want to live under an authoritarian regime, are the ones who are more likely to emigrate. And as a result, you will have a greater share of the population that holds authoritarian compatible values. And this is especially the case when repression is severe and when the intervention lasts for a long time. So it would be completely compatible with our suggestion.
I'm going to insert myself
Sure.
into the conversation. So, the claim here is that support for peace in the 2010s is evidence of this imperial transformation of political skills and values in ways that make the country susceptible, or those voters susceptible to autocratic appeals.
Right.
But I think there's sort of two reasons to doubt this, or to at least suggest a potential alternative change. The first is that, when people were voting for peace at the outset, no one was voting for autocracy. People were voting for redistribution, right? And so this whole Poland B phenomenon, which nicely maps onto the Russian partition, is basically sort of, redistributionist appeals, not sort of, people voting for redistribution rather than autocracy. And this also explains why people would view jobs as about sort of, material needs as opposed to fulfillment. And the second reason is that, there are these huge imperial and communist legacies of economic development, right? So the first partition in 1772, Frederick II basically explicitly says he's going to basically grab, these areas, and he heavily invests in them from the get-go. So by the time you have the partition in 1795, you already had over 20 years of heavy investment by the Prussian government. And this persists under communism, right? Where these are the recovered territories further east. And so the government really heavily invests in these. So what you're really observing here are the legacies of economic development. So then rather than sort of, imperial legacies leading to changed skills and values, what you have are imperial legacies of economic development leading to a material basis for voting for peace and material differences between the imperial territories.
Yep. All right. So these are very, very good criticisms. Now, with respect to the first one, I will say this. I think you're right. Many members or many people in Poland did not vote for peace thinking that they would establish an authoritarian regime, right? So that was not necessarily their motivation. They had other motivations, maybe also religion, maybe other things that motivated them. But I think what is still compatible with our framework is that many observers already in the late 2000s looked at the party and said, there is a real threat of authoritarianism here. Very strong xenophobic attitudes. We actually quote a couple pieces in the appendix. Interestingly, our colleague Volya Charnish wrote a piece I think in the late 2000s on how this party represented a threat to certain values. And the argument that I would make, how this is compatible with our framework, is that if you vote for a party to obtain some kind of material benefit, or maybe religious alignment, or whatever your motivation was, but you do it not paying attention to which values they embrace, that is to some extent compatible with our theory, for the simple reason that if you do not believe in self-government, you just don't inform yourself. Either you neglect that dimension or you discount it in your voting behavior, right? And so I think if people vote because of these other motivations and neglect that dimension, that also exhibits to some extent the values that they hold, right? So yeah.
I mean, look at Trump voters in the United States, right?
Yeah.
Their number one reasons were immigration and inflation.
Right.
A total misunderstanding of how Trump would solve both.
Yeah.
But it was more sort of, it comes baked in with the whole package, right? And so you can still have economic motivations as your first priority,
So
and just disregard the rest.
I'm not an American politics scholar, but I do follow American politics a lot. Yeah, of course. How that's right. But I would say that this case actually further supports what I just said, right? I mean, Trump tried to overthrow the legitimately elected new government, and still voters say, well, I would rather pay attention to the price of groceries, or I would pay attention to migration. And so the fact that they are willing to elect someone shows to some extent, the values that they hold with respect to democracy, right? For them, it's not as important a value, I would make the case. But let me also just briefly speak to your second point. But it's a valid criticism. I don't completely disagree with it. So with respect to the Russian infrastructure legacy, people have made this argument. Economists have made this argument. Maybe the one piece of evidence that speaks against it, this material. So to us, voting behavior is an expression of your political values, right? But its political values are a subset of your broader values. And what I show in a previous paper, you might know it, right, the 2019 World Politics piece on behavior of public administrations, is that even though the Western areas that were under Prussian control, but that later had massive population transfers, actually exhibit the same behavior of public administration. So there's a huge distinction in the behavior, even though they had the same treatment of infrastructure and historical economic growth in the Western regions. So that to me indicates that there must be something other than the economic dimension that shapes values and behavior. It is not a perfect reply to your point of criticism, but maybe an initial one. And we can look into that more. Yeah. We cannot perfectly address your criticism, I'm afraid.
Mirosław Wyrzykowski, Poland. Generally, I do agree with your outcomes of your research, but maybe a few short comments. Firstly, the partition of Poland, as Anna said, started in 1772. Okay. First partition, 20 years later, second partition, and 1795, the final third partition. It was salami activity of the superpowers then, and what happened in Vienna Congress in 1815 was just endorsement of the aggression by superpowers. Secondly, Russian part of the partition. It was interesting because it was the harshest behavior of the government, of the rulers, and we have had two uprisings in 1830 and 1863 against Russians. So it is a little bit more complicated. But second point, I would like to stress in this element of voting behavior the role in the past during partition of the Orthodox Church and throne and altar, and Tsar and Orthodox Church jumped to today's reality, Catholic Church and the Law and Justice Party government. So it has, from my perspective, huge impact on the electoral behavior. third point is indeed, it was 122 years of partition. How many generations? Let's say 5. How many generations you need to be back to the model of behavior, to rid of open question? I have no answer. But the third problem I would like to stress, indeed, is that in 1918, after rebirth of Poland, we have had 20 years till the Second World War. What worked was local self-government, not the government. We have coup d'etat, we have plenty of problems in 20 years, but creation of the self-government was a success. After 1989, fall of communism, what happened as positive element? Surprise, surprise, self-government. So it means that something deeper, deeper in the consciousness of people, with a feeling of the role as citizens, was reflected in the organization of self-government. So that are the elements that I would like to. Thank you very much for your excellent.
And thank you for the comments. So I agree on everything you have said. I don't think that any of it is contradictory to our framework, though. So, for example, the 3 partitions, I think that is correct. It's just that none of them, so the specific lines that were drawn, lasted for a sufficient time to make the difference, right? So this was a very complex history. The one partition that lasted for the longest time, multiple generations, was this one, and that is why we emphasize it. I just want to make the important point. So you're right, it's a very, very complex history, right? 1989, the reintroduction of self-government and really strong gminas, right, at the local level. So very strong self-government. And here, I think what is important is the probabilistic character of our theory, right? So what we suggest is that if you treat certain areas for a very extensive time with repression, then parts of the population and it will move in a certain direction. And you can have other treatments that follow it that move parts of the population back, but you have the underlying shift, and that has endured for a long time, right? And so given that this shift has occurred already, if there are more homogeneous treatments, such as, for example, communist rule, or after 1989, the reintroduction of self-government, that would not annihilate, it would not completely remove the underlying historical shift, right? And so I'm afraid that even if self-government now resumes and exists for a long time, some of these underlying shifts will endure even beyond that.
I hope.
Yeah.
On that optimistic note, we're out of time. So please join me in thanking Jan for.
Thank you.